Our next speaker is Susan Woodland Howard. She graduated from UCLA with a degree in political science. She earned a law degree at the USFV College of Law, where she served as an editor of the Law Review. She's been a member of the California Bar since 1977 and has resided in Silicon Valley, California since the early 1980s. Now retired as a lawyer, she spends her time doing research and writing. She has traveled extensively to examine original records and historical sites in both America and England. During the last 8 years, she has been a continuing education student at Stanford University, where friends on the faculty have encouraged her research and writing efforts. She began by working with old family records that she inherited from her parents. She was surprised to learn that during the United States government's attempts to stamp out polygamy in the territories in the 1880s, her own grandfather, Edwin Penrose, only 8 years old at the time, had been subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury to testify against his father, Charles W. Penrose. During the 1880s, Charles Penrose represented the church in Washington, D.C., in Utah, and in Great Britain. In June 2012, Susan presented a paper on British anti-Mormon William Jarman at the MHA conference in Calgary, Canada. She and her husband David are parents of 2 sons. We are pleased now to hear from Susan Howard, and the topic here is Mormonism in the British press.
During the latter half of the 19th century, the newspaper industry in Britain grew rapidly to fill the needs of an increasingly literate population. London became the center of the manufacture of words, and Fleet Street, the street of ink, became the heart of the news publications. Generally, the British press was considered to be a fair and ethical institution, yet grossly untrue fabrications about Mormonism occasionally appeared in print. Aside from false stories, the indifference of the press toward Mormonism and its adherents was a major obstacle for missionaries in Britain in the decades of the 1880s. The subject of this paper is the work of 3 journalist missionaries, all talented writers and orators who lobbied for fair play and justice from the press. They were Charles W. Penrose, editor-in-chief of the Deseret News, the Latter-day Saint newspaper published in Salt Lake City; Robert W. Sloan, prize-winning essayist and editor with the Salt Lake Herald, an independent newspaper owned by LDS members; and Brigham H. Roberts, an associate editor of the Herald. In 1882, Congress passed the Edmunds Act, a stronger version of earlier anti-polygamy laws that had been unsuccessful in curbing the practice of polygamy in the territories. In October 1884, federal officials in Utah successfully tried and convicted Rutger Clausen of polygamy, signaling that henceforth noncompliance with federal law would be severely punished. Federal marshals armed with arrest warrants began searching for church leaders in early 1885. In February, a grand jury indicted Penrose for unlawful cohabitation after subpoenaing members of his family, including his 8-year-old son, to appear for questioning. At the time, Penrose was in Washington, D.C., working to promote a 6th attempt at Utah statehood, which would give the Saints the autonomy they lacked as a territory. President John Taylor immediately called Penrose to the British mission, instructing him to leave from New York. Penrose had served 2 missions in Britain, the first as a 19-year-old convert from 1851 to 61. Penrose and family then immigrated to Utah. During a second mission in 1865 to 68, Penrose began his journalism career on the staff of the Millennial Star, the publication of the British mission based in Liverpool. Post-mission, he became editor of the Ogden Junction, an independent newspaper, for 7 years until he joined the staff of the Deseret News and moved to Salt Lake. He became editor-in-chief in 1880. He served 3 terms in the Utah legislature and became a counselor in the Salt Lake State presidency. As a news editor, he had exchanged critical and at times rancorous editorials with C.C. Goodwin of the Salt Lake Tribune, an anti-Mormon, anti-Penrose newspaper. Now at age 53, well seasoned in journalism and politics, Penrose began his third mission in his native land. He arrived at mission headquarters in Liverpool in mid-March 1885. Mission President Daniel H. Wells appointed him to preside over the London conference. The assignment suited Penrose. He had been born and raised in London, where his mother and 3 of his sisters still resided. Robert Sloane's father, Edward L. Sloane, was an Irish convert who co-founded the Salt Lake Herald in 1870. Rob, as he was called, was recognized as a brilliant young writer. He was 28 and not yet married when he was called to serve a mission in Great Britain. Utah's congressional delegate, John T. Kane, requested that Sloane begin his mission by spending the winter of 1884-85 as his assistant in Washington. During this time, Sloane worked with Penrose, Kane, and others on statehood matters. He arrived in Liverpool in early April and was assigned to Ireland, where he still had relatives. B.H. Roberts' mission did not begin until early '87, so his introduction will wait. Accusations that Mormon elders were engaged in nefarious activities occasionally appeared in print during the 1880s. In the late 1883, the Millennial Star alerted its readers that William Jarman, former resident of Utah who called himself ex-Mormon priest, had founded the British Anti-Mormon Society with the goal of driving the Mormon missionaries out of the British Isles. Now based in Exeter, Devon, Jarman had published an expose of Mormonism luridly titled USA or Uncle Sam's Abscess. Jarman attracted large crowds to his lectures, which he scheduled just prior to Mormon district conferences. He told exaggerated stories about life in Utah, including easily disproved claims. For example, that Mormons had murdered over 500,000 people, including Jarman's own son, and that the missionaries enticed British women into polygamy and slavery. Not all accounts published about life in Mormon Utah in the British press were so negative. The Honorable James W. Barclay, member of Parliament, described his visit to Utah in 1883 in a positive article for the 19th Century, an important British periodical. In the same year, Phil Robinson, a war correspondent and reporter for the London Telegraph, traveled through Utah and the Western Territories on behalf of the New York World. The Saints regarded his article and his book on his experiences, Sinners and Saints, to be fair and even complimentary in his portrayal of Mormon Utah. As expressed in one Millennial Star editorial, Mormonism was unpopular, and newspaper editors were afraid to manifest an impartial disposition towards an unpopular cause. British critics of Mormonism often claimed that it was not so much the religion itself, but the practice of polygamy they opposed, and polygamy was not popular. Missionaries defended polygamy as a commandment of God, supported by biblical precedent and a pragmatic solution to certain modern ills. Critics regarded the practice as barbaric, Asiatic, and in the modern age that was increasingly cognizant of the rights of women, a step backward. For newspapers seeking to raise circulation numbers and attract advertisers, articles about the allegedly scandalous activities of Mormon missionaries sold more editions than did those that remained true to traditional content. As missionaries, Penrose and Sloane continued to write for their home papers in Salt Lake as well as for the Millennial Star. They defended the church and wrote articles about life and politics in Great Britain, Penrose under the pseudonym Exile, and Sloane as Wanderer, or as the Salt Lake Tribune called him, Wandering Bobby. The London papers, however, showed little interest in publishing the missionaries' articles. For General Conference in 1885, the First Presidency had prepared a letter to be read to the Saints defending the constitutional rights which the federal officials violated, including the right to a fair trial, an impartial jury, and the presumption of innocence. On May 20th, Penrose sent copies to the leading dailies. The next day, he sent copies to the weeklies. On Friday, May 22nd, he sent the letter to the 19th Century. In each case, he offered to condense the letter and turn it into an article. But within days, he received rejections from every single paper. 2 weeks later, he sent copies of an official protest addressed to the Congress and President Cleveland by the Utah Saints to the leading papers with no acceptances, although at least 2 articles appeared in areas outside metropolitan London. Penrose's first acceptance was a letter to the editor of the Belfast, Ireland Telegraph in July, after an unruly crowd prevented him from speaking on the Custom House steps. Penrose considered the British press to be dull. In his June letter to the Deseret News, he wrote, "What a dreary and leaden thing is ordinary English journalism. It lacks the spice, piquancy, snap, and enterprise of American newspaperdom. Much fault is found with the Associated Press at home, but something of the kind here would put new life into the sleepy columns of the London dailies. There is more meat in the Deseret News in a week than in an English paper for 6 months." London's Pall Mall Gazette soon remedied the lack of spice in a demonstration of the new journalism in Britain. Beginning July 6, 1885, the Gazette published a series titled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, based on several months of investigative research into practices that trapped young women into lives of prostitution and addiction. Before publishing the articles, Gazette editor William T. Stead assembled a secret commission to assist him in finding solid evidence to prove his allegations. The series sparked controversies in the press that continued for months in Britain and the United States. Inevitably, comparisons were made between corrupt Englishmen and Mormon elders. Nevertheless, the Maiden Tribute series may have opened the door for Penrose to gain access to the London press, although in a roundabout way. In mid-August, after a crowd stirred up by confronted Wells, Penrose, and others at a district conference in Sheffield, the police had to escort them to safety through what Penrose described as a howling crowd. Although, as recorded in Penrose's diary, the incident did have comical aspects, the threat of violence was real. A few days later, a news item headlined, "A Mormon Riot at the East End of London," appeared in several London newspapers. The story was reprinted in the weeklies, local presses, and in American newspapers. According to the report, on Tuesday evening, August 25th, a mob attacked and beat Mormon missionaries after becoming enraged by reports that the elders were systematically kidnapping young women and shipping them to Utah to be sealed to rich Mormons. On October 29th, the Salt Lake Tribune noted that William Jarman had sent a letter to the paper indicating that the mobbing may have been due to his work. The letter was dated August 16th, the day of the Sheffield disturbance. Whether or not Jarman had somehow placed the false report, he wanted to take credit for it. The London Evening Standard rejected a letter from Penrose, which was later published in the Star, in which he asserted that he could positively state that no attack whatever has been made upon the Mormon missionaries in London during the present year. Penrose had been in London near Mile End Road, where the attack had supposedly taken place on that evening of the 25th. Nevertheless, the false reports made the Mormons newsworthy. In early September, a London Chronicle editorial and a traveler's letter claimed that the most recent company of immigrants departing from Liverpool included a new element, the Irish, and that before this, no Irish person had made it to Salt Lake as a believer in Mormonism. The Chronicle agreed to publish Penrose's rebuttal, which he signed, "A Londoner from Utah." Penrose complimented the Chronicle, saying that it gave place to the other side, unlike the London Evening Standard, which ignored his offer of clarification on another erroneous article. The Pall Mall Gazette had published a report of the East End attack, and with Mormons in the news, editor William Stead decided to send a reporter to interview Penrose. With unintentional irony, the Gazette's September 15th account of the interview began with this quote, "So little is known about Mormonism, and so much curiosity has recently been shown respecting that sect, that we decided to take advantage of the conference which the Latter-day Saints are at present holding in London in order to gather a few actual facts from one of themselves." Penrose's opinion of the interview was that it was garbled but not hostile. He must have been pleased with the reporter's description as an interview with Mr. C.W. Penrose, the intelligent and talented president of the conference. After 9 months in London, Penrose was called home to Utah in October 1885. Robert Sloan was released 10 months later in August 1886. President Wells requested that he stay on a few weeks longer to organize a meeting intended to bring to the attention of the London press the claims of unjust persecution of the Mormon people by the United States government. Sloan approached reporter Phil Robinson, who agreed to act as host for the program. Robinson engaged St. George's Hall, one of the finest and most aristocratic halls in London and only 3/4 of a mile from Fleet Street, hoping to attract newspapermen and residents of the affluent area nearby. A more modern take on it. 10,000 handbills were printed and distributed, and larger bills were placed on boards carried through Fleet Street, Strand, Regent Street, and many of the principal thoroughfares by 20 men, all in a row, commonly known as Sandwichmen, and of which the streets are never free. The bills were titled, "A Bitter Cry from the Persecuted Mormons of Utah," and "For Fair Play and Justice." The October 12th meeting disappointed the organizers. A reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune counted 63 in the audience, while the correspondent for the Salt Lake Herald estimated 100 in a hall that held more than 500. In introducing the speakers, Robinson proclaimed his objectivity and monogamous status, as well as his admiration for the Mormons. The crowd was unfriendly and heckled Sloan as he spoke in defense of polygamy, yet his wit and sincerity won over several of the reporters. Sloan later wrote that the evening was a financial failure and that Robinson, who had backed it, was out 20 pounds. According to Sloan's survey, the meeting was noticed in 5 of the morning dailies and an equal number of evening papers, but only one of them was fair. Otherwise, reviews were negative. The Salt Lake Tribune's correspondent, however, praised Sloan as the only really sincere Mormon he had ever seen. He is a smart young fellow and pleased the audience hugely. A second Tribune article reprinted negative reviews, including that of the Telegraph, which criticized the elders for leaving practically untouched the question of persecution. The Salt Lake Herald pointed out that although missionaries had little access to wealthy Londoners, even the negative coverage would allow readers to understand that the Mormons had been wronged. According to George Osmond, an assistant editor of the Millennial Star who was tireless in denouncing misleading press reports, the account of the Chronicle was fair, tolerably fair. Osmond noted that the London Daily Telegraph, one of the greatest newspapers in the world, deemed Mormonism sufficiently important to publish 3 articles on it, yet invariably denied requests to print corrections to even the most reckless charges. Sloan returned to Utah at the end of October without scheduling further meetings. In December 1886, Brigham H. Roberts, husband of 2 wives, was arrested and charged with unlawful cohabitation. Shortly after his release on bail, he attended a hasty meeting at the Herald offices with Apostles Heber J. Grant, an owner of the Herald, and John Henry Smith, who called him to the British mission where his talents could be used on the Millennial Star. He left Utah the same evening. Roberts, a former school teacher, had joined the staff of the Herald following his return from the Southern States Mission, where he served from 1880 to 84. A native of Lancashire, Roberts was nearly 30, and other than his few months with the Herald, he had not yet begun his prolific writing career. Throughout 1886 and 87, Jarman had not relaxed his relentless opposition. He issued repeated challenges for a public debate on the doctrines and practices of the Utah Church. Roberts accepted the challenge, but insisted on a neutral chairman to enforce compliance with debating rules. The debates, which drew crowds in the thousands, took place in Yorkshire, London, Sussex, and concluded in Swansea, Wales in July 1888. 3,000 noisy, antagonistic listeners drowned out Roberts' speech. The crowd voted that Jarman had proved his charges against the church, but Roberts won in the long run. 2 local newspapers published Roberts' follow-up letters, and a third Welsh paper interviewed him, allowing Roberts to present proof of Jarman's falsehoods. Local papers also printed letters from witnesses to Jarman's lectures, witnesses who expressed their disgust with his behavior. Jarman's ungentlemanly behavior turned public opinion against him. A report that he had been convicted in a Swansea police court of inciting violence against a Mormon and accusations of fraud by 2 of his followers gave readers another chance to see a different side of the anti-Mormon. In December 1888, the Deseret News reported that after years of apathetic indifference, there had been a remarkable revival of interest in Mormonism in Wales. After returning to Utah, the 3 elders resumed careers as journalists, editors, lobbyists, politicians, and church leaders. The threatening figure of the Mormon elder continued to haunt the pages of newspapers, fiction, and soon the silent movies. Back to Gazette editor William Stead, who became a friend and defender of Mormonism in the years before World War I. He demanded that reporters investigate and write honest articles about Mormonism. Thank you. On Mormons in the news in Great Britain or in Europe. So if there's a graduate student or someone who would like to do research on this topic, the field is wide open.
Now, are you addressing simply the historic, as in the late 19th century, or are you looking at the treatment of Mormons in the modern press in Great Britain?
I don't know of any treatment of modern Mormons other than brief mention. So as far as I know, that whole field would be great for somebody to research. And now with it, online articles, the British newspaper archive is online. Great opportunity for someone.
You wouldn't have to go to Great Britain.
Oh, but you could. You could.
One of the great thrills, of course, of academics is to travel to that area. I just asked Brother Ron if he would respond to my question, which is, he talked about the preponderance of socialist thinking and socialist parties in Durham. I wonder how the LDS reacted to this. Were they socialists as well in that area? Did they bring that political philosophy with them to the United States?
I'm so grateful that you asked that question, and if I would have had more time, I would have been able to address many more topics in the paper. This particular aspect of the research was the most enlightening piece for me, as I discovered that the preponderance of socialism in Durham during this time period was near universal. So the Durham County residents that were joining the church were part of this socialist feeling, and it was simply this: because the mining industry retained and maintained the traditional relationships between landowners and non-land owners, there was intense antagonism against capitalism, because the only capitalists that they knew were these landowners that controlled everything. They owned the houses, the land, the farms. They owned everything. And so there was a feeling even among members of the church. Now their solution to it wasn't to adopt, rather than bringing their socialism to Utah. When they got to Utah, they realized, oh, we don't have those conditions here. We can own land. We can be private landowners. We can pursue it. We can pursue the American dream. So as they came to Utah, of course, they discarded those feelings because the conditions surrounding them or that caused them didn't exist here.
An ancillary question: did any of them express later on that they left County Durham because of the socialist dominance?
That's a great question. No, while they were in County Durham, they embraced and were enamored with the Labor Party or the Socialist Party, because they saw it as their only way to get some air, their only chance, their last chance to escape the capitalist oppression. So they didn't leave County Durham because of the socialism. Rather, they left County Durham because of the capitalism. Did I understand your question correctly?
I hope I expressed it correctly.
Did I answer it though? Yeah. So it was the capitalism that caused them to leave, not the socialism. And when they got to America and realized they could own, Brigham Young would send them out, and okay, go help us get this place going. And then when they got there, they could own their own land and have their own farm. And it was just such a new experience for them that they discarded their disdain for capitalism and their embracing of socialism.
If you'd pardon me, one more question, that would be, did these members of the church in County Durham have connections with those in America who wrote back and said, the big dream is land ownership, come and join us here?
That's a great question. You would think that would be the case, but my research points away from that and towards the missionaries. What would happen is the missionaries would bring over, this goes hand in hand with your presentation, the missionaries would bring over printed materials, a lot of it by the newspaper publishers, that were like leaflets or pamphlets or almost advertisements for living in Utah. And they would show them, and they had pictures in them of Provo. One of the ones that's mentioned a lot is, come to Provo, Utah Lake, and it's beautiful green place. And so it was the missionaries that were promoting the land ownership more than letters from home.
From the Germanic perspective, which is my specialty here at BYU, it was the missionaries indeed who fomented emigration. And as President Uchtdorf mentioned in a talk just a few years ago, weakened the church significantly. So Was the church weakened significantly with this immigration of LDS out of Durham County? They were indeed.
Eventually, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Have you thought of any questions you'd like to direct? Yes, brother.
Yes, on the topic of the church and the British press, if we could fast forward to 2014, are you tracking any British press on the pending summons of President Monson to London for this charge of fraud?
I know about it. I've heard about it. I haven't read the legal papers that deal with it. I've been busy getting ready for this program. So I understand that the hearing or whatever it is that's coming up is just a preliminary thing, and I don't think that Monson or President Monson needs to be there. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this.
You're a good person to have, though, on this occasion there. Nice to have a barrister who can give us an opinion. Could they ever really ask him, compel him to appear in Great Britain to answer to what we might consider to be frivolous charges?
My understanding is that if, according to this summons, if he does not appear or answer, they can issue an arrest warrant for him. Now, the question is, would the United States be willing to extradite or respond to an extradition request from Great Britain if Britain made it? I doubt that they would, and I doubt that, but that's my opinion. I sincerely doubt that the United States would extradite him on this matter.
Those of us who discussed this, and brother, you probably have with other people, can imagine a flood of similar charges brought against any number of Christian church leaders, for that matter, against the Pope, under the same auspices. So, any other questions? Yes?
Actually, my question is more general about the conference. I understand that the speaker tonight, Terrell Gibbons, is going to be over in a different location. And how do we get there, and is there parking?
I have some comments on that. First of all, could you join me in offering these people one more bit of recognition? Yes, we do invite you to consider joining us for the continuation of the conference at 7 p.m. Allow me to remind you that the Joseph Smith building is at the far southwest corner of the upper campus here. Parking is going to be a challenge. If you do not arrive there by about 6:30, you will not be parking within a few hundred yards of that facility. Surface parking almost impossible to find after 6:30 this evening. Some parking underground beneath that enormous Joseph F. Smith building. Otherwise, you might need to plan on walking at least 400 yards, maybe 600 yards from the parking across the street from the Hinckley Center. We invite you to join us then this evening for Professor Terrell Gibbons here from Virginia, a very respected, accomplished, and well-known LDS scholar. Thank you very much for your attendance today.